Tonight on Dateline. One community, 3 families, 3 mysterious murders.
She turned away from him and he shot her in the back of her head.
The killings all follow the same terrifying pattern.
It was the kill shot as he was trained to deliver.
As you described.
Dennis Murphy asks, were these young mothers casualties of war? From our studios in New York, here is Stone Phillips.
Good evening. It is the best of times in any tight-knit military community, the day loved ones return safely from war. But for families in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a homecoming quickly turned into the worst of times. Within a few short weeks last summer, 3 young women, all wives of Army Special Forces soldiers, were murdered by their husbands returning from the war in Afghanistan. It was a crime wave that shocked the Army and the country and raised the question, are we doing enough to ease the transition from war front to home front so the pressures that build up over there don't explode in violence back here? Here's Dennis Murphy.
Special Forces soldiers are the pride of the U.S. Army. Relative handfuls of them routed the Taliban in Afghanistan in a matter of weeks. They are resourceful, mobile, lethal.
We're training that soldier to accomplish the mission. In many cases, it's going to involve violence. It's going to involve killing other people.
But when 3 of those Special Forces soldiers returned from Afghanistan and murdered their wives, people wondered if the military had created a few commando misfits who couldn't distinguish between the killing fields and their own bedrooms.
I'm kind of concerned about my sister and my brother-in-law. They're not answering their door.
Sergeant Rigoberto Nieves and his wife Teresa were in their bedroom when he shot and killed her, then himself. 3 weeks later, in another bedroom, it was Sergeant Bill Wright. He confessed to smashing his wife Jennifer with a baseball bat and strangling her. He concealed her body in a shallow grave in the woods, then took their 3 boys on an overnight fishing trip. Sheriff's officers were still at that burial site when their radios crackled out more bad news.
The call comes in, we have another one?
That's correct.
Another wife apparently killed by her military husband.
Correct.
Andrea and Brandon Floyd. He was Delta Force, the most elite of the elite. The mother of the soldier's wife was told there'd been a ferocious argument in the bedroom.
And he shot her in the back of her head. And then shortly thereafter, he took his own life.
Penny Flitcraft said her commando son-in-law killed her daughter as efficiently as if she'd been the enemy.
It was the kill shot as he was trained to deliver. It has a very crude term in the military. It's popping the grape.
A painless death, theoretically.
I pray.
Teresa. 3 Special Forces soldiers, 3 wives murdered within weeks of one another. All of them based at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. There was a somber candlelight vigil there in memory of the slain women. Questions. Were they victims of superbly trained killing machines who couldn't find the off switch when they returned from combat?
We're taking people and expecting them to do things that are not morally acceptable in a civilian world and putting them right back in their households.
On Thursday, you could be killing the enemy, and Friday, you
That's
could be
correct.
taking the kids to McDonald's.
That's correct. What happened in that room in those last few seconds was not Brandon, the father and husband.
Who was it?
Brandon, the soldier.
Colonel, Fort Bragg in the summer of 2002, what happened here? Was it murder by Afghanistan? Was it caused by their special training to be warriors?
We don't think so, but that doesn't mean that we just, write it off as a coincidence.
Colonel Ted Davis is the garrison commander of Fort Bragg, something like being a mayor. He has 46,000 soldiers at his post, more than half of them married.
Your people are exposed to flashpoints of violence in places like Afghanistan. 18 hours later, they could be sitting with the family.
And that makes it tough.
Was the battlefield still so fresh? Were these 3 soldiers still so wired that they snapped in a domestic crisis as though they'd come under fire? It was one question of many the colonel needed answers to. He began meeting with civilian and military counselors, chaplains, and experts on domestic violence to get some understanding of what went wrong here. The Pentagon ordered the top Army psychiatrist, Dr. David Orman, to assemble an expert team and investigate the string of homicides.
We were clearly concerned about what specifically was happening here at Fort Bragg.
The investigators wondered at first if an anti-malarial drug prescribed for Afghanistan, Lariam, had anything to do with the violence. There has been some suggestion Lariam may trigger hallucinatory or suicidal episodes in some users, but the military quickly dismissed the drug as a cause. It was when they looked at the histories of the three doomed couples they found the underlying reasons for the spate of murders. A slow but steady erosion of three marriages, coming apart under the pressures of daily military life.
Marital discord was a major factor in the occurrence of these tragedies.
In the first case, Sergeant Rigoberto Nieves and his wife Teresa started fighting almost as soon as he got home. Only 48 hours after leaving the battlefield, he shot her, then himself. Then there was Bill and Jennifer Wright. He'd strangled her and buried her body in the woods. He'd been back from combat for 3 weeks.
I love you, Jennifer. I miss you very much, honey.
The sister of the wife Wright bludgeoned and strangled thinks that the marriage disintegrated under the stress of constant assignments overseas for months at a time. Afghanistan, Bosnia, Africa.
She was alone a lot, you know, while he was doing his job. To me, he was married to the Army. He wasn't married to my sister.
The third murder, the Delta Force commando who shot his wife, then himself, the Floyds, is another story of erosion and cracks. As Brandon Floyd's military career soared, his home life was disintegrating.
The marriage had gotten to that point where they were both becoming incredibly unkind to each other.
But none of his commanders seemed to notice, because according to his mother-in-law, for the most elite of soldiers, there's special meaning to don't ask, don't tell. Going for counseling in the military, she thinks, is career suicide.
In the military culture, what happens to someone like Brandon if he goes for counseling, if it's available?
He is no longer in Special Ops or Delta Forces. That's an immediate black mark on your record and you're out.
I bet that we could walk over to Fort Bragg and find any number of printed manuals, doors saying counselor here. Mm-hmm. I'm sure all the apparatus of counseling is there, am I right?
It is there, absolutely. But it's an unspoken rule.
When those fact-finders from the Pentagon came to Fort Bragg to investigate the murders, they heard the same complaint over and over. A soldier cannot seek counseling and be guaranteed confidentiality. His or her officers are informed, files are opened, and before long, promising careers are finished. And the Army's top psychiatrist doesn't disagree with that take on things.
In reality, there's some truth to the perception.
Dr. Orman's research indicates many soldiers do leave the military within months of seeking professional help. But he thinks it's because they ask for counseling too late. So the top psychiatrist suggests commanders be more attentive to early clues and signs of distress in their soldiers. In fact, in 2 of these murders, there were overlooked warning signs that not all was well at home. 2 of the soldiers had asked and received permission to be released from the battlefield in Afghanistan for emergency home leave.
Nieves, why was he released early, do you know?
He was released and allowed to return back here, to Fort Bragg because there were issues with his family.
Sergeant Wright, why did he ask for early release from Afghanistan?
For the same reason.
Those are extraordinary requests.
They are.
In the future, do you put a red flag on guys that are in that situation?
I think you do. That's something that we have already, taken into consideration.
Do you believe now that the military needs to be more mindful of the domestic part of their soldiers' lives?
I think that that's something that we've learned as a result of the tragedies that occurred here at Fort Bragg this past summer.
Now U.S. servicemen and women are coming home from another war to their country's respect, honor, and thanks. And after many a joyful reunion, will come a time for some of adjustment as the warrior gets reacquainted with domestic routine.
How long does it take a soldier in a combat situation to shed the stress of that violence?
think it's going to depend a lot on that individual soldier in terms of what they've been exposed to.
Especially vulnerable, it seems, are couples like the Nieves, Wrights, and Floyds. Husbands and wives who had marital problems prior to deployment. Sometimes troubled couples tend to remember only the good times when a spouse is off fighting a war. But reality upon returning home can be crushing.
What advice would you have for spouses, for the children to be aware of and mindful when dad comes home?
Number one, they ought to be very proud, as I was with my father when he went to Vietnam. And I can remember it took some time for us to get back together as a family. It didn't happen overnight.
Not automatic dad, right?
Exactly.
7 children were left orphaned in the wake of the 3 murders. Wilma Walker has taken on the emotional and financial responsibility for raising her 3 grandchildren, left behind by her daughter Jennifer Wright. The boys their father took fishing after burying their mother.
On the whole, it is really hard on our Father who art in heaven. The youngest one first prayed for Mommy to come back until I finally couldn't stand it anymore, and I told him, you know, honey, Mommy's not going to come back. She can't. And then he started praying for Daddy to get out of jail.
Daddy, Sergeant William Wright, called from prison, asked for his wife's family's forgiveness, and hoped they'd raise the boys up to be, in his words, strong Christian men. On the first day of the war in Iraq, as special forces stormed into that country's western desert, Sergeant Wright tied together the bed sheets in his prison cell and hanged himself.
Just last month, the Army started a new program designed to ease the transition to life back home. Instead of going straight back to their families, soldiers returning from Iraq or Afghanistan are now required to remain on duty for 4 or 5 days and be counseled on how to reconnect with their spouses and children. The program is mandatory.